Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. One second, I'm sharing the link so that others can join us. Can someone give me a written salam? Okay, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So what we're going to do today is just we're going to try to solidify what came before, given some of the comments that have been made by the students. We're going to look at an article, اختلاف الفقهاء, diversity in fiqh as a social construction. And we're also going to look at, and this is kind of ambitious on my part, we're going to look at the ethics of disagreement in Islam by Dr. Taha Jabir, rahmatullahi alayhi, rahmatan wasiya. And some people didn't get a chance to get the book. I tried to actually look for the link. It used to be available. But I gave the ethics of disagreement as a alternative source to the Insaf. The best translation of the Insaf, and it's still a little rough, is that by Marcia, Dr. Marcia, I believe her last name is Hermanson. Just one second. Okay, so the Insaf is actually part of the Hujjatullah al-Baligha. Some scholars say that it was written independent, but you can find it in the book Hujjatullah al-Baligha. It's under the section which deals with the differences of the scholars of fiqh and hadith. But it also is published independently in the English language by Dr. Marcia Hermanson in a book which is called Two Treatises on Islamic Law by Shah Waliullah, which is العقد الجد في الأحكام والاجتهاد والتقليد. I'm sorry. Trying to make sense of the transliteration is العقد الجد في أحكام الاجتهاد والتقليد. And that treatise deals with the issue of ijtihad and taqlid. It's like Shah Waliullah's magnum opus in that regard. And so she combined both texts, the one that deals with differences of opinion among the ulama, and then she combined the one text in which Shah Waliullah rahmatullahi alayhi is laying down some ideas with regard to ijtihad and taqlid. That's probably the best investment. You can get that from Amazon. It's worth the investment. Other than that, if you wanted to just get the Hujjatullah al-Baligha, that's worth it as well. The differences of opinion, in fact, this translation has some issues by Dr. Muhammad Abdul Wahab, but it's still beneficial. It just needs to be refined a little bit. But it's probably the cheapest bet. Again, it was online PDF. It was easily accessible before, but That was some time ago. So I wanted to begin to utilize our time wisely. It's going to be a tight session today, time-wise. I wanted to begin with an article that was put together by Dr. Muhammad Khalid Masood entitled Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha, Diversity in Fiqh as a Social Construction. And if you want, you can pull this up. I'll give you a second to pull it up. Muhammad Khalid Masood, Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha, Diversity in Fiqh as a Social Construction. And is being published on Musawah, musawah.org. Okay, so let's begin. First of all, Dr. Muhammad Khalid Masood is a university professor in the Pakistan region. He has written some articles and published some books in English regarding matters of maqasid and usul in fiqh in general. He tends, of course, to have a Hanafi orientation. And I say, of course, because many of the ulama in that part of the world, they usually work out of that outline. And he deals with some interesting ideas. We don't always come to terms with what he says, but that's a human reality. The title, Ikhtilaf al-Fuqaha, Diversity in Fiqh is a Social Construction. Rayhan, is the voice clear? Can someone give me a voice check so that I know that the audio is working properly? Okay. Firstly, and we still didn't forget about the Bidayat al-Mujtahid. We're going to go back to it. I just wanted to close up with these ideas and at least give you some exposure to the literature that's out there which specializes on khilaf, and then you'll have to kind of work from there. Bidayat al-Mujtahid, we'll continue reading from it. Those who, after the overall session is done with, want to continue reading it on a personal level, or if the group wants to continue reading it on a personal level, we can do that as well. But there's some tools that are necessary in order to properly understand the text as mentioned before. And this is to understand that Bidayat al-Mujtahid comes within the context of ikhtilaf literature. Is a certain type of writing. Not all scholars are trained in it. Not all scholars are known as khilafi, meaning ulama that have an ability to navigate why it is that scholars come to a point of differing and the underlying causes of differing. Not all scholars are khilafi. And so there is a body of literature which is there. It has existed for a long time. Some of it has been codified and written. Other parts of that knowledge were conveyed orally. It has existed since early on in Islamic scholarship and is probably one of the most beneficial ways to make sense of the world today, to train in khilafi literature, because it gives you the mindset and frame of thinking that allows you to navigate diversity in a way which is grounded and rooted. So ikhtilaf, of course, this is the beginning of any study on the khilaf literature, is to investigate the term, which is scholarly methodology, to investigate terms and how they fit into a larger scheme of thinking. Terms, when related to each other, give you a concept. Concepts basically are a bunch of terms categorized together. When concepts are brought together with principles, then you have a methodology. Ikhtilaf, which means disagreement, difference of opinion, and diversity of views, especially among the scholars of fiqh, is widely recognized in Islamic tradition as a natural phenomenon. And I'm not going to go into all the details in this regard because Dr. Taha covers this also, or takes this up in the first part of his book, Ethics of Disagreement, or in Adab al-Ikhtilaf. And so there's some differences which are considered natural, some which are considered an outcome of intellectual diversity, and some differences which are considered problematic. So there's that natural difference that's in nature that we see day and night, right? Sun and moon, the differences that we see in the seasons, that we see in temperature. So this is why reflecting on the Quran in this regard, and actually this whole concept here of how this title is done, diversity and unity, or unity and diversity, that is a Quranic concept. And it manifests itself in art, it manifests itself in the thinking of the Muslim community early on. Dr. Ismail Farouqi, rahmatullahi alayhi rahmatan wasiya, and Lois, his wife, may Allah have mercy on her as well, they took up this concept of Islamic civilization and the idea of art and the ethos of it. In any event, we got the point. So, ikhtilaf as a basic feature of Islamic law. Historians narrate that when the Khalifa, so the political authority, Mansur, began unifying the caliphate, his secretary Ibn Muqaffa advised that the law and order situation was particularly problematic due to the lack of uniformity among the scholars of fiqh. And I'm paraphrasing to go faster. The judges at that time were issuing divergent and conflicting judgments which caused legal chaos. So the political authorities came to know that Imam Malik was compiling or had compiled the Muwatta, which is a compendium of the Sunnah and fiqh and so on and so forth. On his pilgrimage to Mecca, he visited Imam Malik and he proposed that Imam Malik make the Muwatta to be a standard for the Muslim community, but Imam Malik disagreed with the wishes of the political authorities and persuaded against it. One of the things that he had argued was that the companions, I said this before and I'll say it again, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayhi, as a principle he lays down, that the knowledge of the Sunnah is not embodied in one person when we talk about the companions. It's embodied in all of the companions when taken together. That's why to study the lives of the companions, or the Salaf as they say, in the earliest generation, their followers, is very important. Some of the textual evidences point out to 3 generations, to 4 generations, and then some point out to 2 generations to be looked at or considered as that model generation to follow. 2 generations with 1. In any event, the companions and the tabi'in become the sources of the Sunnah. And specifically the companions have to be taken as a whole, not as individuals to say that this one has more knowledge than the other one. This is one of the things that led to differences of opinion early on among the scholars, is that they would take a hadith from certain circles of the companions and ignore others. And they all had their reasons for doing that, but the later day scholars, like Imam Ibn Taymiyyah said, he talked about that the knowledge of the Sunnah is contained in what? Is contained in the practice of looking at all of the companions. So Imam Malik, one of the arguments that he made was that the companions left Medina or the Medinan area, and they migrated to different places and they took knowledge of the Sunnah with them. That being the case, if he were to standardize the practice of the people of Medina as far as the Muwatta is concerned, if he were to universalize it, then it will be problematic given that there's ahadith accounts that are in different places. So his response is embodied in the story as follows. Abu Jafar, he made Hajj. He called me. I went to see him and we talked. He didn't call him on the cell phone, yo. There was no cell phones at that time, right? He summoned him. I went to see him and we talked. He asked questions and I replied. Then he said, I have resolved to have several copies made of these books that you have composed, the Muwatta. I will send one copy each to every Muslim city. I shall order the people to abide by its contents exclusively. I will make them set aside everything else than this new knowledge because I find true knowledge in the tradition of Medina. I said, oh, Commander, this is Imam Malik. Amir al-Mu'mineen, do not do that because the people have received various reports, heard several statements, and transmitted these accounts. Each community is acting upon the information they have received. They are practicing and dealing with others and their mutual differences accordingly. Dissuading the people from what they are practicing will put them in hardship. Leave the people alone with their practices. Let the people in each city choose for them what they prefer. Mansur said, upon my life, had you complied with my wishes, I would have ordered so. So Imam Malik had the opportunity to make his approach dominant, although he felt his approach should be dominant, but he didn't move forward with that. I hate to say this, but the Hanafis took a different approach. When they came into the power, they used the court system and they streamlined their madhab, and people became obliged. Even in the time of the Mu'tazila, when the Mu'tazila gained power, the Mu'tazila, many of them were Hanafis in fiqh, but when they gained power, it was a school of Aqidah and a school of, it had a certain set of principles that they used in understanding the deen. They tried to force everyone to come into their system. And this is one of the reasons why Imam Ahmed fell into displeasure with them, because he opposed them. He opposed them in certain points of Aqidah. He opposed that approach. But you find that that has happened from time to time, where the political authorities try to impose a certain type of scholarship, and this is to show you the level of literacy that was there in the Muslim community at that time, where the political authorities had an understanding of what was being practiced and taught. So you're talking about people being mujtahidun as well. But in any event, Imam Malik, being an authority in his time, he declined. Now the Mu'tazila were not Ahl al-Hadith. They were opposed to the people of Hadith. Mu'tazila were not Ahl al-Hadith, and they vary in orientation, just like the Shia vary in their orientation or their degree. Although they don't like to be characterized as such, some of the Shia of Yemen were Mu'tazila. The Hanafis were Mu'tazila. Some of the Hanabila, very few, but they were Mu'tazila. The Malikis really didn't have Mu'tazila among them. And I can't recall right now what was the influx of the Mu'tazila into the Shafi'i school, but it was minimal. But the Mu'tazila, many of them were Shia and many of them were Hanafi. So at this point in time, Dr. Khalid, he says, Malik's advice marks the significance of differences among the scholars, right? And he enshrined the right to differ in front of the political authorities. Imam Malik recognized the fact that disagreements among the jurists were informed among other causes. So it wasn't just a matter of differing for the sake of difference, but there was a basis to it. Well, the issue of Iraq being the stronghold of the Shia, that's not an old phenomenon. Because if you look at Imam Ghazali's time, Iraq and all that region, even Iran and all that region, it was actually dominated by Sunnis. So today's geographical reality with regard to madhahib, because the Shia have their madhahib, is actually, some of it is new. Some of it is, like for instance, even the issue of all of us reciting the Hafs recitation in Quran. And I'm responding to those who may not know, I'm responding to a comment that was made by one of the students or the study partners. The the Hafs recitation that most of us recite was not dominant. It became dominant because of the publishing of the Mus'haf on the part of the Saudi authorities. And when they published the Quran and they distributed, that became the mode of Quran that mostly everybody's reciting, although there's a diversity of recitations. If you go into Maghrib region, they're reciting Warsh. If you go to Libya, they're reciting Qalun. You know, if you go to some places in Africa, they're reciting Durri. You know, and so you see some places they recite by multiple qira'ats. Barakallahu feek. So in this position that Imam Malik took, Imam Malik noted from early on that there were differences among the ulama and they were rooted in a hadith in this case. And we know that linguistic differences already existed. I'll post this article up for the students to look at, or the study partners. Imam Malik also began to reference the practice of the people of Medina, and he entered into a discussion with an imam of his time, which is called Imam Layth ibn Sa'd, or Imam Layth bin Sa'd, rahmatullahi alayhi. Imam Malik entered into a discussion with him based on usul, the principle or methodological system of how we research into Islam. So Imam Malik noted that among the scholars, one of the causes of differences was hadith, but also in his engagement with Imam Layth bin Sa'd, he noted that there were also research methodological differences. And he wrote a letter to him, or a treatise, and Imam Layth wrote a letter back, or a treatise back, and they debated on these points. Also, the Hanafis also had these discussions with regard to their positions in research methodology and the position of Malik. So early on, there was a literature that dealt with these issues at the research methodology level. And also the ulama, they had an understanding with regard to hadith that there were differences of opinion among themselves as to what hadith is accepted or what hadith is not. The point being is that Islamic scholarship had already laid out principles to deal with differences of opinion, and that was necessary so that the discussion is systematic and is scholarly, and it can be corrected, and it can also be accepted or validated. Versus just he say, she say, everybody has an opinion. That's your perspective, my perspective. There's no way to judge. That can never be the case in Islamic knowledge, given the fact that the basis of Islamic knowledge is revelation and reason. It's not just reason and feeling. When the issue of feeling and perception and all of that, which is really not knowledge, that comes to be the case. That is your perspective, my perspective. You do your thing, I do my thing. There is a realm for that in Islam. In Islamic scholarship, that's the realm of dhan. The realm of dhan is when you move out of the realm of certainty. And so when you move into the realm where things are plausible, there's levels of acceptability. Some things are acceptable because they're supported, and then other things are acceptable because they're plausible and still need more support, and then some things are rejected. It's a judgment without a basis. It's a presumption without support. So it doesn't reach a higher level. So Islam looks at this reality with grades, Islamic scholarship. The reality when you move out of what's certain the realm of what's certain, clear, absolute. There's no room for differing. This other realm, the realm of the dhanniyat, as we call it in usul al-fiqh, here there's degrees and layers of knowledge. And that's where reason and research come in. And a lot of people are not comfortable with this realm because there's levels to it. So it's not just always clear cut. Some people like things to be black and white. So in Islam, there's a realm where some knowledge is black and white. There's no room for debate for the most part. And then there's the other realm where there's layers, of certainty. It's not 100%. And so at that point in time, you need to have some knowledge and there's room for differing there. So Imam Shafi'i, is that clear or there's some ambiguity to that? I wouldn't say opinion. It's usually translated as opinion, but if we had to translate it for the sake of simplicity, I would say that there's is the realm of plausibility, right? Where you have situations that need to be investigated, or when you have an educated guess, or you have assumptions that are made, but they still need to be researched, is the realm of discussion, right? Is the realm of discussion. So some discussions are at a high level, and they are discussions. That's why I didn't say is uncertain because it's not 100% confirmed, but I say plausible because now you're giving space, because it could be the case that something is researched and then it becomes part of the Assalamu alaikum. It becomes part of the the realm of certainty, right? So everything that's dhanni, like for instance, this is something that's very important in the usuli discussion, because the tradition that's mutawatir is considered a tradition that gives you a certain type of knowledge. Some of the scholars say it gives you certain knowledge, so it's not up for debate. And then the dhanni tradition, which is most of the hadith, is there's room for debate, but some ahad traditions with supporting evidences will reach the level of certainty, although they're not mutawatir. This discussion becomes complicated for those who don't have any hadith background. But let's say that you have some things which are clear cut, it doesn't need support. Then you have other situations which have supporting evidence and it becomes clear cut. It becomes, yeah, there's not much debate about that point, and so you have other things. Again, the realm, the discussion of plausibility is better. Is something plausible or not? If it's plausible, why? That's the realm. If it's plausible, why? Right. It's not just the issue of that's possible and that's it. No, it has to be plausible, meaning it has to still be supported in research. So that's why I just don't want it. The reason why sometimes they say opinion is because there's more than one insight into the matter. But it's not just an issue of loose interpretation or perspective, I should say. It's an issue of supported, investigated interpretation. Is that clear or no? Okay, so then in the article, he talks about how also Imam Shafi'i had written on it, Imam Malik had written on it, the Imam Layth had written on it, the issue of differences, the Hanafis had written on it. So there was already a written discussion that was taking place. Dr. Khalid, he puts the Hanafis as being the first ones to actually start to codify their stuff in a systematic way. That's neither here or there for me. The scholars overall, were discussing the issue, and that's what's most important right now. Who came first and this and that, that's another discussion. He comes to the point now where he says, in the history of Islamic legislation, which is a book written by the Azhari Sheikh Muhammad al-Khudri, he described how difference has been, or ikhtilaf has been, one of the prominent characteristics of fiqh throughout its history, existent since the days of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, during the early period. And he says that there are a number of examples in which the companions differed with each other on various matters. Most of these cases in which there was no clear guidance, in other words, it wasn't clear cut, qat'i, certain. It was a realm of plausibility in which there was room for discussion, room for more than one insight. This is where a lot of times you find flexibility comes in the deen. But it's not, again, we're not just talking about a realm of chaos. We're not just talking about a realm of relativity in its most extreme sense. We're talking about, when we talk about the realm of plausibility, it's like, for instance, you know how the GPS will give you a route and it tells you this is the quickest route based on these reasons. And then there's an alternative route, but it says it adds on minutes and another route. So it'll give you four possibilities. But those four routes are not all exactly the same, but they get you to the same destination. Those are plausible ways to get to your destination. All of them have to be supported in time, and all of them have to be supported as far as being, logical routes to get there. And so there has to be some actual evidence to show, like if they tell you, travel on the water, or if they tell you take a plane to get to your destination, that's not plausible at the moment. As an idea, you may be able to take a boat, you may be able to take a plane, but it's just not plausible in that type of scenario where you're using a GPS to get from point A to point B. So you may come up with something of a position, but it may not be plausible within that context, right? In the context of discussion. Like if you're gonna talk about salah, you just can't make stuff up. There's a hadith which talk about salah. Okay, some of those hadith may be subject to just being understood in one way, and some of them can maybe be understood in multiple ways. But then you start narrowing down what's plausible, what's not plausible. So you may be able to understand a hadith in more than one way. Then the question, understanding the hadith in more than one way. Okay, the Arabic language opens up to more than one position. The usage of the Arabic speakers early on allow for contradictory positions. Like, for instance, with the word qur, in the Quranic sense, you find that it can mean the menses or it can mean the purity. Those are antonyms in meaning. So one word can have opposite meanings. So because the Arabs of that time used it in that way, that's plausible. But then you may have another hadith which comes and designates that no, in this particular situation, you can't take the two meanings. This one meaning is determined. And so you may have initially started out with more than one possibility for understanding, more and more by the investigating the Arabic language, by investigating the Quran, by investigating the Hadith, by investigating practice. You limit the possibilities. So it's not going to, instead of 5 opinions, now you may have only 2 opinions which are legitimate. At first, it may have seemed like the 5 opinions are plausible, but then they become eliminated with evidence. That's why I said it's not just a matter of perspective. It's a matter of what the evidence is supporting. Linguistic evidences, principles, textual evidences. That's part of the process of scholarship. right? And so a lot of people are not comfortable with that realm because it's a realm where you have to have intellect involved, and that intellect has to be disciplined with principles and evidence. You just can't creatively make things up. So differences were already there. So among the ulama, later on, after the earlier generations, one of the things that had began to limit difference was the whole taqlid movement. The taqlid movement, what it did, the taqlid movement, which was for scholars to follow other scholars rather than investigating themselves. The taqlid movement, what it did was kind of systematize what came before and say that we agree that we're going to just work with these opinions, these conclusions, these principles, these evidences, and we're going to stay in this realm. So that limited, for instance, the before there were more than 8 schools, and so the limitation now became to restrain or restrict scholarly schools to 4 main schools. There's more than that still, but in general, that's the concept. And so the issue of difference of opinion became limited to the differences between those schools and the differences that were present within each school. And so with that, you kind of had this control system. The control system allowed for there to be some clarity. And so moving forward, differences of opinion can come back to interpretive disagreements, right? How you reconcile texts with each other, how you understand the point in the Arabic language. Sometimes issues of abrogation, right? What happens with ayat, of the Quran produces conflicting views or ahadith. So some scholars they dealt with the issue of abrogation. Abrogation has 2 meanings. One, it means that to qualify the meaning of a thing. Because you're qualifying something, you're taking away the original meaning. Like if I give you a general statement, all Muslims are good people. And then I say, except those who have sin, right? Just as a way of simplifying. I took the original meaning, which all Muslims are good people, and I limited it because I changed the general statement. I changed the meaning. So sometimes especially the early scholars, they looked at the concept of abrogation as being that you're changing the meaning in something that was said before. So you're kind of taking away something from the original meaning. So they consider that nasakh. Other scholars, especially the later day scholars, consider the meaning of nasakh to mean that you don't practice a particular ayah of the Quran or hadith. So those are 2 opposite meanings of nasakh. And that could lead to differences. The differences with regard to sources. So for instance, you have the whole debate about, when the ijma takes place, or the whole concept of istihsan. I'm not going to get into all the details of that because time doesn't permit. And then you have the whole issue of the madhabs, you know, following a mufti in the madhab, who's followed, who's not followed. So you have differences in fatwa, right? And so you have different levels of knowledge as well. All of those things bring differences of opinion. You have a number of other issues that he brings up, but I'm going to stop there with that because I wanted to at least spend the rest of the time looking at the book Adab al-Ikhtilaf, or Ethics of Disagreement in Islam. So I'll send the one source I already sent out. So I just look at the introduction right now. It says that when the original manuscript for this book was under preparation over 10 years ago, this was a while back now, We never imagined that it would be perceived as an explanation of the etiquette envisioned by Islam for those engaged in discourse and disagreement, regardless of the subject. Notice that here Sheikh Taha Javid is saying that the book on ethics of disagreement, which was written to talk about the issue of fatwa, issue of fiqh, and all of that, became a standard book for talking about differences overall, regardless of the subject. So that the point being is that this knowledge is beneficial even if you take the application outside of the subject matter. And we mentioned that before. Likewise, the group we had in mind when we wrote the book was not the entire ummah, but rather a small section within it. So the circumstances that led us to write on this subject were that a number of Islamic groups in the Muslim world had split up after coming under government pressure. Thereafter, they began to take opposing positions and soon fragmented themselves into numerous Islamic parties, associations, factions, and coalitions, each with its own agenda. If you look at the time of Imam Malik, the political authority tried to do that as well, put pressure on the Muslim community to take certain positions. To make matters worse, the focus of each new group seemed like more than an effort to outdo the others in hope of capturing the support of the masses. Yet the masses were totally confused by these developments. For most sincere and simple Muslims had always supposed that their problems would be solved when the parties calling themselves groups. Imagine their disappointment when those parties split and began disputing among themselves over abstruse points of fiqh and aqidah, entirely forgetting the higher aims and purposes of the ummah. In their efforts to support their claims to represent true Islam, some of these groups went so far as to label the other groups as disbelievers, apostates, heretics, etc. So since this, I'm skipping a little bit now, since the book was originally intended to address these opposing Islamic political parties in one particular part of the Muslim world, the author went to great lengths to give examples from history. Although this book may be more appropriately titled The Ethics of Disagreement Between the Scholars, the classical jurists, it nonetheless serves as a useful introduction to the subject of disagreement in general. And so then the first section he talks about chapter 1, the malaise of discord. The contemporary Muslim world is afflicted by numerous diseases which have spread to almost every aspect of its being. Right? Moral torpor, which is like a sluggishness, or just stagnation. Intellectual paralysis, subversion from within, subjugation from without, the absence of justice and fair dealing, exploitation and corruption, extremes of ignorance and disease, poverty and waste, dependence and insecurity, discord and internecine strife. Everything is still going on today. The number and gravity of these afflictions are capable of wiping whole nations and people off the face of the earth, even though some may be well endowed with wealth and resources. So that's the context that he's writing in. What goes on among the Muslims. This is a trend which is in total contrast to the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. After stressing the paramount duty of affirming Tawheed, both the Quran and Sunnah stress one thing above all: the unity of the Muslim Ummah. Their object is to treat and rid the Ummah of any disagreements which disturb the peace and harmony in Muslim relationships and ruin the brotherhood of believers. It may also be true to say that after the abomination of associating others in worship with Allah, there is nothing more repugnant or disdained to the teachings of Islam than discord in the Muslim community. So he's making the argument that the Quran enjoys unity. So then, if there's difference, how do we deal with it? That's going to come up. So I'm skipping around a little bit. Aside from the issue of unity, if differences of opinion operate in a healthy framework, they could enrich the Muslim mind and stimulate intellectual development. They could help to expand perspectives and make us look at problems and issues in their wider and deeper ramifications and with greater precision and thoroughness. So here, he mentions the point that the Quran is stressing unity against disunity, but then now he's talking about the benefit of differences. So that means that there's, like we mentioned before, there's a difference, as a set of differences or type of differing that's acceptable and a type of differing that's not acceptable. So I'm moving on to the next chapter, the chapter 2, the spectrum of disagreement. The Arabic term ikhtilaf denotes taking a different position, of course, from that of another person, either in opinion or utterance or action. He goes into a lot. His treatment of the term ikhtilaf and khilaf is more detailed than many, and so is more scholarly in that regard. So the term ikhtilaf denotes taking a different position or course from that of another person, either in opinion, utterance, or action. The word khilaf is from the same root word in the Arabic language as ikhtilaf and is sometimes used synonymously with it. Khilaf, which basically means difference, disagreement, or even conflict, is broader in meaning and implication than the concept of ikhtilaf. So this is so because two opposites are necessarily different from each other, whereas two things, ideas, or persons that differ are not necessarily opposed to each other in conflict. So differences between people may begin with differences of opinion over an issue. So, ikhtilaf denotes a different position or course from that of another person, either in opinion or utterance or action. And khilaf, which basically means difference, disagreement, or even conflict, is broader in meaning and implication than the concept of direct opposition. So the issue here, the difference between the word ikhtilaf and khilaf, if you say that they're not synonymous, is this point of conflict. So he mentions that there's the issue of, you know, debate, the issue of jidal, right? Stubborn adherence to its own opinion or position on the part of one or both parties that are at variance with each other. The attempt to defend the position, to prevail on others to accept it or hold it against them. These are all elements of disputation or jidal, right? He called it jadal. Jadal or jidal implies carrying out a discussion in a contentious manner in order to gain the upper hand. That's a problem. And so, but this is also a science that some of the scholars engaged in, right? That they engage in debate at this level. So this later definition implies that jidal or dialectics is not a science based on advancing any specific evidence, but rather a skill or talent which enables a person to overcome the other. So it's the science of how do you persuade the other to change his opinion, but it's not a science in an Islamic sense, in the sense of Islamic knowledge. Sometimes the word dissension or shiqaq, you'll find that. And so now you see, we're going from ikhtilaf to debate, contentious debate, to now shiqaq or dissension. Sometimes the dispute may become severe and harsh, with the disputant's only concern being to get the better of his opponent. There's no concern for finding out the truth or clarifying what's right. It stops, precludes any form of mutual understanding or agreement. The term dissension or shiqaq may be applied in this situation, right? And so then he moves on that there are acceptable differences and unacceptable differences. So, Allah created us in diversity, biologically and so on and so forth. That's acceptable difference. Sometimes you have the possibility of understanding things in more than one way. We see that among the Sahaba. That's acceptable difference. But when it becomes contentious or it becomes an issue of trying to support something that's not supportable, right? Or when it becomes harsh and severe, when it becomes a position of animosity, that's problematic. So he talked about difference in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so that's important here when we talk about the issue of the realm of dhan. We shall not concern ourselves here with dealing with the various issues on which the companions differed during or after the lifetime of the Prophet. This is just in this section, right? Nor shall we detail on each issue who adopted the literal or obvious meaning of a text. on the one hand, and who reflected on it and scrutinized it on the other hand. Such undertaking will take volumes. Moreover, it must be borne in mind that the companions themselves appreciated all of these circumstances, one to take something literal, or one to understand the deeper meaning, right? So it was the proficient scholars who were capable of making an analysis on these issues and coming to an independent judgment, right? Who painstakingly strove to investigate the full ramifications of the Sharia and set out its purposes, the aims of, or objectives, right? Sometimes they would adopt the literal or the manifest meaning of an expression. Sometimes they would engage in an interpretation. Briefly, so we have uh, three types of interpretation when it comes to that realm of dhan. One which is plausible. A close or plausible interpretation is one which can be easily sustained from the meaning of the text itself, the import. For example, giving to charity, funds appropriated from an orphan's trust, or wasting such funds can be both constructed as tantamount to eating up the property of the orphans, as is noted in the Quran. Those who eat up the property of orphans only eat fire in their bellies. Okay, so that's a close or plausible interpretation. A remote interpretation then is another type, is one which requires a far greater degree of pondering and probing into the. It's not clear cut. You kind of had to bring it out. It may be supported, but it's not just at face value. So he uses the term close interpretation. I say I say this is all in the realm of plausibility. So you have that close interpretation, which is evident that there's support for the meaning in the text. Then there's that remote interpretation, which means you have to dig a little deeper and bring evidence to support. And then he gives the third, that there's a far-fetched interpretation that is so, you really have to work at supporting, justifying, the meaning here. And that's pretty much problematic. So the rules of interpretation. It is clear from what we have said that interpretation requires an ability to ponder and reflect on the real meaning and purpose of a text, or the import. Otherwise, it is safer to adopt the more obvious and manifest meanings, right? So if you have to go deeper, that means that you're going beyond the literal and what's clear to you or manifest. Interpretation is only admissible in matters on which there's no clear guidance in the Quran or the Sunnah, and in which requires the use of rigorous reasoning or ijtihad, or research methodology. In matters pertaining to belief or aqidah, there's no room for that. And it is necessary to adopt the meanings as they're found and what is properly and strictly sanctioned by the text itself. This is always the safest method and one which the early Muslims follow. However, there are texts which require interpretation. Remember that there's the close interpretation, there's the remote, and there's the far-fetched. And this is in the electronic version, this is on page 17, 16, and 17 of the Ethics of Disagreement. Early on in the book, you'll see it. So first is that you got to respect the rules of the Arabic language. That's the first rule. And he goes into some other details, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into that. You can't violate principles of the deen. You can't go against another text. There's rules to interpreting. And so then he goes into the historical context in chapter 4, which he deals with differences of opinion among the first generation, differences which arise after the death of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, such as when Abu Bakr became the political leader, and some of the Muslims they refused to give zakat, or that the companions differed with regard to the status of the Prophet. Umar bin Khattab, he didn't accept the death of the Prophet at first. So that was a point of differences over the Prophet's burial, who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I mentioned the zakat issue. Then the differences with sects began to emerge, not very tightly, but the Khawarij, began to emerge in their initial phases. Right, they didn't come full blown, but that was in the time of Ali and Ibn Abbas. Then differences among the companions themselves with what happened with Uthman that became a different reality. That's not the, the focus right now, but that became an issue. He goes on into another chapter dealing with that. Then he gets into the scholarly differences. After the age of the companions of the Prophet and their eminent successors in the period from the end of the first century after the Hijrah to the middle of the third century, there appeared some 13 schools dealing with fiqh or madhahib. They all identified with the Sunnah, which was and still is the predominant school in the Muslim world. Unfortunately, only the works of 8 or 9 of the leading scholars of these schools have been fully or partially recorded. From these recorded works, in their various forms, the usul and methodologies of different schools have become known. And then he mentions the leading scholars. So he says that there were what? 13 schools. So some of the leading ones were Abu Sa'id al-Hasan ibn Yasar al-Basri, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam al-Awza'i, Imam Sufyan al-Thawri, Imam al-Layth bin Sa'ad, Imam Malik, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Muhammad bin Idris al-Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, and there's others as well that you find mentioned in Bidayat al-Mujtahid. Bidayat al-Mujtahid then is an encyclopedia for positions of ulama. So, for instance, when it comes to the issue of the imamah of the woman, you note that Imam Ibn Rushd conveys the position of Imam al-Thawri, right? I'm sorry, Imam al-Tabari. Imam al-Tabari. So Imam al-Tabari, he was also an imam who had his own method. So there's two overall methodologies. The methodology of the people of Hadith and the methodology of juristic reasoning. And so the first 3 scholars that belong to the school of Hadith out of the 4 madhabs is Malik, Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad. These are considered the jurists of Hadith and those established precedences of the companions of the Prophet. Their jurisprudence was that of the people of Medina, whose knowledge they propagated. Imam Abu Hanifa, however, was the inheritor of the jurisprudence of the upholders of independent reasoning, or juristic reasoning, becoming the foremost of this school in his age. He wasn't the only one, but he became known. The difference which existed between the school of Sa'id bin Musayyib, who was the leading tabi'in, whose teachings were based on the jurisprudence and established precedents of the companions of the Prophet, and which enjoyed the support of the Malikis, the Shafi'is, and the Hanbalis, and the school of Ibrahim al-Nakhai, which relies on juristic reasoning in the absence of established precedent. This difference was naturally passed on to whoever adopted methodology of either school. So Dr. Taha Jabir rahmatullahi alayhi rahmatullahi wasi'ah, he's making the argument that the schools of fiqh that we know today, they gain their identity or their shape from realities that existed before them. He goes into the principles of each madhab, the methodology of Abu Hanifa, the methodology of Malik, the methodology of Shafi'i, the methodology of Imam Ahmed, the methodology of Imam Dawood al-Zahiri. And then he goes into reasons for different. And so he says that there's natural reasons, there's linguistic reasons for differing, there's differences over hadith, there's differences over juristic methodology, and I also would say there's differences over application, right? And so we'll end with that. There's more to say on that issue, but if there's any questions, please shoot, inshallah. I think we covered a good amount I think we reached the ambition that we had. We were able to fulfill it, which was to look at both texts. And I think that gives a good summary. This part is very important. Even if you guys have to take 2 weeks even if we take the next 2 weeks just to review for the exam together, it doesn't have to be. We can review as a group versus have this type of class I advise those who don't have the book and can't find the PDF to purchase it. It's not very expensive. I've tried my best to keep, the cost of doing this class to a minimum. And, for less than $10, the Insaf, you can get it in this version, or you can go with the more expensive version. But it's worth getting. Some have bought Bidayat al-Mujtahid, some have used the PDF copy. That's all your preference. I think the major cost was the Bidayat al-Mujtahid, and there's a PDF for it, so there's not an issue there. But this needs to be solidified because there is no reading of the Bidayat al-Mujtahid with proper understanding without this stuff. And this section, the principles or methodologies of the Imams in the book Ethics of Disagreement is very important to understand. The reasons why the scholars disagree is very important to understand. Those two sections really are what I'm concerned with. The historical reality is important as well, but the historical reality is not going to help us directly right now in Ayat al-Mujtahid. It's just part of understanding this body of knowledge, the historical backdrop. I'm talking about differences of opinion in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and among the companions. That backdrop it doesn't really help us in the immediate. What helps us is to understand why it is that the scholars early on differed, what were their methodologies, because that's really what's being covered in Bidayat al-Mujtahid. Bidayat al-Mujtahid is reconciling between those methodologies and opinions. And so understanding, that's very good. Okay, inshallah. So if there's no more questions, we'll take it to the Telegram. I've been extremely busy these past weeks because we're in Jersey. We're launching the Esperanza Community Hub, and we started opening it up, but we're coming into a more full-blown operational situation. And walaikum salam. So we've been, myself and Imam Wesley have been involved in that project. So it's been taking some time, and so we need to at least we need to set up some time to at least talk, so that we can get prepared for the oral exam, and then we can try to spend the next after we do the oral exam and deal with this portion of preparation. Then from here on in, we'll continue to read the Bidayah. And we'll probably have to have a few intensive sessions in order to finish the Salah book, like we mentioned. And we won't be able to cover everything in detail. That's why I want to make sure that you understand with clarity each person in the group, and then from there, you'll have some ability to kind of work with the text a little bit, despite its difficulty. So, like I said, we'll spend next week, even up to 2 weeks if necessary, preparing, take the test, and then, we only have a few weeks after that. Whoever wants to continue the class, we can continue the class, but there is a limitation that was put in that I had promised that the class would be a set amount of weeks. And so with that, inshallah, we'll end it. Nobody had any comments. And so we'll meet on the Telegram group. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.